Hello, very beautiful community. Let me know if you can see and hear me. And we are going to have a chat. I think because we've called this Iran, it might be a smaller group. I don't know. So could get to answer more of your questions. Two brief announcements first before we start. I'm having a very luxurious hot chocolate. That's what I'm doing. You guys are just a sort of a background for me. I'm focusing on my hot chocolate. That's the first announcement. Mm. Mm. It's with almond milk, but it's very nice. So my second announcement is also a me announcement. Yesterday, I was in my wheelchair and I held the arms of my wheelchair like that. And I put my feet on the ground and I put pressure on my feet. And I began to, but didn't lift myself off the wheelchair. So my bum was still fully making contact with the wheelchair. I just did that for 3 seconds. And boom, it's like a couple of grown men started sitting on my neck and on my throat straight away. So I'm sitting here with feeling quite a bit of pressure and So if that affects the way I answer your questions, I'm sorry. But one of the good bits of news is that how much I struggle with my physical illness doesn't affect the negativity or positivity of how I respond to questions about the world out there. Now, back to my first announcement about the hot chocolate. Yeah, this is really good. It's really good, beautiful community. My hot chocolate, I just can't stop winning with it. Iran has got oil rain falling on it in Tehran. Things are not going very well for the Trump administration that's coordinating this war very closely with Israel, but they don't necessarily have the same political ends. For example, Israel, in my assessment, and Bibi, in my assessment, would not mind a collapsed state in Iran. And that's a worry, especially as the US administration, via Trump's ludicrous fancy for spectacle, is just siphoning itself on to the Israeli project there. Let us do our ritualization of scrollification upwards to see if we can take some questions very briefly that were left in advance, because we are very narcissistic ourselves. We have NPD as a community because we just love ourselves as a community. And that's why we always scroll upwards to give respect to those of us who left questifications before. Newtonify, who I recall asked for permission to ask a Ukraine question, which is all right. I'm all right with that today because, I mean, for goodness sake, this calamitous carousel of stuff is all interconnected. It seems to me that Putin's... So sorry, we'll start with Ukraine, but we're also not sorry that we'll start with Ukraine. We don't talk enough about Ukraine. It seems to me that Putin's theory of victory depends on the West withdrawing support. Correct. This could happen when post-truth groups gain power, but would he stop the war if those groups were to show weakness in upcoming elections? No. Orban could be out this year, which is going to be a very interesting meditation on how many institutions and to what extent you need to capture to be able to stay after potentially losing an election. In other words, Orban can stay even if he loses, but he's not guaranteed to stay even if he loses the way Putin is. So how much is this affecting Putin's thought? Zero. Basically zero. Because Putin has already priced in a kind of expectation for how well or badly he expects the ex-conservative authoritarian right, which for him is normal politics, to do. He's priced it in, and he doesn't care about one electoral setback here, one electoral pleasant surprise there. He's already aware that this is a process that wobbles, and that is partly why he's not going as hard into alliance with Trump, because he's worried that Trump might be replaced by a Democrat president. And he could be dealing with Gavin Newsom in a couple of years. And he's even worried he could be dealing, he wouldn't be likely to be, but he's worried he'll be dealing with Marco Rubio. He doesn't know. He's pricing that in now. He's not reacting piecemeal to any of this. So basically, I would say Putin's course is not altered by these electoral accelerations or setbacks. Dane of the Hill, good to see you. Could you elaborate on our inability to have a conversation with ourselves about our society? Look, that's actually a phrase I've often used about Ukraine, not us, which faces greater problems than we face in talking to itself about itself. But because it's both got tremendous internal challenges and it's under grave external assault from the tyrant in the Kremlin. And Dane, you're saying, I think the wonderful Alastair and Rory on The Rest is Politics are becoming a good example. If you mean that they had a quarrel and it was bad on the last show, I don't think it was bad. I think it was really good. I thought it was really good for them to have a quarrel. I think they should have more. There's a limit to how much it would be good to theatricize them in the packaging that the producers did. It actually didn't work for them very well, that individual clip. It worked all rightish. But it's interesting. I don't think that any quarrels they have are remotely in the realm of unconstructive disagreement or inability to talk. I think their conversations with themselves are constructive. And in fact, positively inclusive, not just of everybody in the UK, but inclusive of different sort of marginalized countries, minorities around the world. Our big problem is that we have lost the capacity to share fact worlds and mental worlds together. Our other problem is that we are increasingly thinking even offline in post-truth terms. And what's absolutely just tragic about it for our societies is that you can have two citizens with actually originally the same type of grievance, but they can't talk to each other because they're in completely unreachable fact and mental worlds. Both are post-truth, but in a different way, or one is post-truth and the other isn't. So we've got this, if you like, psychotic social crisis, whereby human beings are finding it intolerable to address reality as it is, and they need to substitute its features with something that they wheel in with their imagination, with the help of people they listen to online. So this kind of psychotic incapacity to bear the real world as it is very difficult. And it's ubiquitous, right? We've got this incapacity in this group, right? We can't face things we don't want to hear. We can't face things we don't like. We can't even face things that are more complex than, what we want to accept. Now, you guys are doing very well with this particular issue, but most people are not. Namely, most people are really struggling with how to weigh up the fact that this Iranian regime is a real mofo. I mean, it's a real calamity. If we're talking about gaps of legitimacy between regime and population, that is apocalyptic, what you've got, that gap. They're bathing in blood, they're sinking in corruption, they're giving religious lectures to their population. I mean, you could hardly get a bigger disgrace. North Korea is a bigger disgrace, but you could hardly get a bigger disgrace, with very few exceptions. But regime bad doesn't lead to thoughtless war on regime good. And even these two things, people are overwhelmingly struggling to keep in mind. So we're really dealing with a double doubly thorny infantilization of our citizenries. The first thorniness is that we think like children. And the second thorniness is that we think like children for reasons of legitimate social forces dragging us there. So, in other words, we think like children, but not because we're stupid and immoral. That's much harder. You can sort of begin to blast people out of stupidity. You can't blast people out of social forces induced collapse in trust and belief in that there being a difference between truth and falsehood. Right? So, for example, a percentage of that is a product of the powerlessnesses generated by economic exclusion. It's irrelevant to lecture these people on smarting up or being analytically better, if that's the central driver of how they have stopped dealing in truth versus falsehood in the way they process reality. Somewhat of an answer for you, Dane. Sky falling. Another question on Ukraine. You mentioned previously that autumn 2022 was a genuine nuclear crisis. Yes, in my view, it was. What are the chances such a crisis happens again, and what might bring it about? It could happen between the United States and China over Taiwan, although in the medium term, I'm skeptical about the US capacity to stand up for Taiwan. And it could also happen if Putin is beginning to lose very badly in Ukraine. And so, because Putin is doing a lot better in Ukraine than any of us want, the risk of nuclear war is now much, much lower. The risk of nuclear war was at its peak when Putin was on the verge of doing a number in his pants because he was afraid. Basically, and also, by the way, notice in our couple of analyses on the main channel of Ukraine's Kursk incursion how that did not increase nuclear risk. They don't care about territory in the Kremlin. They care about regime survival. If the regime survival is on the line, then Putin will again return to nuclear threats, the exploitation of nuclear deterrence. Some of you would call that nuclear blackmail, others wouldn't. Now, the Russians are thinking gently about just tinkering with their nuclear keys a bit in response to the war in Iran, but they're only going to do it a little bit. So we're not going to have a nuclear crisis unless some contingent event happens to do with a misunderstanding, or unless the Kremlin begins losing really badly. There is another scenario in which a nuclear crisis could occur, and that is if the Kremlin rapidly takes all of Ukraine and wants to move forward. But neither that level of success nor that previously mentioned level of failure is on the cards for the Kremlin. Therefore, we do not anticipate a Russo-American nuclear crisis as things stand until something changes. NYC, Mr. Samioza. Lots of love. Besides voting, what can I do for impact to constructively protect what remains of my democracy with limited bandwidth and time? And that's a nice way of putting it, right? Because it's not like we're all citizens here and we're all thinking, wow, how am I going to dedicate my day to my democracy better? You've got to go to work, and work is good or bad or average or both or overwhelmingly stressful. And then you've got kids, and then you've got other commitments, and then you've got something else. And so it's very important when we talk about politics, we realize that our citizens are busy and stressed and often very fearful about their own future. So, it's not like we've got some kind of, assembly of citizen deliberation when we, gather here in this privileged space and discuss what citizens can do. Apart from voting, talk to strangers who you're not algorithmically connected to online. Have dinner parties, talk politics offline, keep yourself sane, be psychologically prepared for democratic collapse while knowing that it might well not happen, but be psychologically prepared. Don't be just in a complete beside yourself state if that happens, because then you won't be able to react. And often when a democratic collapse occurs, there is going to be a possibility to get your democracy back, at least at first, right? I mean, swing that round to the Russian context. At what point did Putin become undislodgeable? I think Putin was overwhelmingly difficult to dislodge by the early 2010s, but he was still dislodgeable there. It's a hard ask, but still dislodgeable. He's not dislodgeable now. He hasn't been dislodgeable for a long time. So don't freak out if your boat sinks democratically, because that's not going to lead to societal collapse or anything apocalyptic. You're still going to go to the cafe and have an amazing hot chocolate. Wow, amazing. So that's an important thought. In any interaction with political representatives, tell them you need them to be bold. If you're writing letters to them on particular topics, tell them to be bold. You're in some kind of public event with them, tell them to be bold. You're leaving comments under their YouTube channels, tell them to be bold. Obviously, if you had more leeway, it'd be good to have some kind of connection to the local community politically, to get involved in local politics, even if it's you going to some meeting about local speed limits, because you yourself, I'm just pouring myself some extra hot chocolate. Yes. So you yourself touching politics and you showing other citizens that they can touch politics is very, very powerful. A citizen who feels that something they have done has brought it about, there is now a bench in their local park, whereas there wasn't before and they wanted one, is less likely to lose all faith in national institutions too. Don't lose yourself in algorithms, right? Don't, be very careful online. Don't follow British political philosophers online with Soviet origins. They're dangerous. They're untrustworthy. They consume far too much hot chocolate. So you've got to be really careful. Also, do stuff you love as a counterbalance to finding politics really difficult. And for your political involvement, find something positive about politics. Try to not make all your interactions with politics negative, right? So, for example, let me see if I can give an example. Sorry, I'm going to do a terrible. I won't put a link in, but I'm just going to go like this into the thing, into the text, into the thing. And I'm going to share a biography of Machiavelli with you. By Alexander Lee. What's so amazing about that book? It's that he puts you into Machiavelli's world. He talks about the weather. He talks about what it's like to make a trip from one city to another in Machiavelli's world. It's wonderful. So what happens if you do that 15 minutes before bedtime? It's you touching politics in a positive way. It's not just negativity coming to you from politics. Because unless you are a professional geek like me, you're probably going to be weighed down by the disasters you're witnessing everywhere. I'm not. Because when I watch the orange monster child misconduct himself on the global stage and make everybody's lives worse, I'm observing humans doing politics, which for me is elevating. But for most people, it's not. For most people, it's not elevating unless it's actually positive. For me, it's elevating if it's destructive, because I'm a geek. So make sure that an element, that a part of your connection with politics is positive. And I've just given you one example in which it can be that. But it might not be right for you. You might hate books, you might hate audiobooks, but find something that's right for you, so that you don't train your nervous system to think politics. Right? We don't want that. We don't want citizens who feel like that about politics. Okay. Farmer's Daughter. I was thinking of the Gogol poem you shared in one of your main channel videos. So this is one of my early videos on the interaction of Russia's cultural identity crisis and its propensity to do war. And I use that framing as an excuse to talk a little bit about Russia's identity crisis and how much Russia is or isn't a Western country. And I quoted Gogol, who basically asks of Russia, where are you heading? Where all of this commotion, where are you going? Give an answer. She doesn't give an answer.
Sorry, I don't understand.
It's because, silly Apple Watch, you are there to optimize my sleep. I'm not talking to you now. So, it's a conversation about a country that thinks that it's absolutely central to it that it should have a sense of historical destiny, but that that destiny isn't teleological, it's not Fukuyamian, it's not connected with some kind of global triumph of a social order of which Russia is going to be a representation, nor is it known, and nor is it even clear that it's knowable. And now you're asking, is the United States in a similar predicament? No, not at all. The United States, if anything, is in the predicament of having a very cartoonish and somewhat optimistic picture of its purpose that needs to be complexified. And one of the reasons for this naivety is just that the United States is a country that is born effectively into modernity. The United States as a country has no pre-modern history. We all do in Europe. We are different to you because of that. We were here in 1400, and what we were doing here in 1400 has some impact on who we are now. And you just weren't there. In fact, you were us back then. And you hadn't moved. So that's very, very important. And so there's this kind of naive historical amnesia induced optimism that America's self-framings often come with. And then, of course, America's sense of destiny is very Fukuyamian. So it's the very opposite of the Russian sense of destiny, which is un-Fukuyamian and unknown and maybe even unknowable. America's sense of destiny is sort of 2 + 2 = 4, Francis Fukuyama. That's rock and roll. So this needs to be, America's self-image needs to be brought into the adult world and need to be related to an adult sense of a nation's capabilities. Russia's identity needs to be dug from beneath some kind of deep confusion and denial and pathology. That's quite different. Question from Amulai from Montreal. Wow. Haven't been to Montreal in a long time, 25 years. Do you think this geopolitical escalation with Iran increases the chances of Trump doing more moves on Canada or Greenland later, maybe even in the third term? If Trump got away with this as easily as he did with Venezuela, maybe the answer would be yes. Tendentiously, given that he's getting sunk in a quagmire, the answer is no. But in rapidly transforming political systems, you can't answer a question like that beyond the next 6 months to a year. So we've got to be very clear about that. I think immediately in the next month or two, if this went Venezuela style for Trump, and if Iran were Venezuela, which it isn't, I'm not saying Venezuela went well for Trump in the sense that lots of problems with what they did there, but he thinks it went very well. He doesn't think this is going well. He thinks the spectacle of it is very impressive, but he's worried that this is not going well. So in the next few months, if this went very well for him, and he could just terminate it in a few days with some kind of more negotiable leadership in Iran, which is not happening, then it inclined him to do more. What I would say in general is that when you have a narcissistic personality disorder and you throw in tremendous impulsivity on top of that Trump has through his neurodiversity, the shit you do grows. You capsized a truck of hay yesterday. You need to capsize a whole barn of hay today. It needs to keep getting bigger and bigger. What you do. So, have we done the early questions now? Let me just scroll on and see. Catalyst is asking me how I think Mamdani is doing. I'm probably leave that for another time. He has managed Trump well so far, I would say, understanding how to exploit Trump's love of New York and Trump's love of success. I just saw a ground war question. Yeah, okay, Catalyst as well. What's the odds of a ground invasion? They're much higher than zero. Even though that is something Trump is very allergic to in general. Thimble, how could we understand Pete Hegseth's focus on violence? He talks about killing Iranians. So what Hegseth is doing is getting off on neo-fascist emotion, getting off on the emotion of action as an end in itself, of action as power and power as truth. So that's fascism, but in a kind of crappy derivative, cheap cornflakes cereal box form. It's not the real thing. It's a sort of awful sort of Fox News social media version of it. So it's a kind of a postmodern kitsch caricature of fascist emotion that is still really gets off on, and it's very disturbing with him. I mean, you can even see this sort of sick emotion clearly has a very big role in his sex life. Stephen, Could Trump's NPD focus on chaos become our salvation as his rule becomes untenable? He'd rather see Dems succeed than Republicans succeed without him. Don't. I think you're roughly right, but don't confuse Trump imploding with Democrats succeeding, and don't confuse Trump imploding with democracy benefiting. The more, this is the paradox we face, the more post-truth authoritarians make a mess of their own political projects, the more ripe our democracies are for post-truth authoritarian takeover. That is what a lot of people are still not connecting. And it's back to these, two thoughts rather than one problem. You've got to keep two thoughts in mind. Trumpism will collapse and it'll implode. That will increase the chances of post-truth authoritarian governance. Because when this is done to your democracy and stuff is shaken and possibilities of what you can say and do are disinhibited, that leads to more authoritarianism, not less. So Trumpist collapse leads to more authoritarianism. As long as you understand that it doesn't lead to some kind of renormalization of democratic practice. The only way it would is if the Democrats came up with a project, which they haven't got at the moment, a national project. And that also ties up to our previous conversation about speaking to each other collectively as a country. So I think you're right, but understand that that's not simply a kind of good news for Trump's opponents, because Trump's opponents are not Trump's opponents. They're opponents of the kind of anti-democratic and authoritarian calamitous politics that he brings with him, right? So again, as long as you frame that with the understanding that the 2030s will throw up harder challenges to democracy than Trump has, then that's an okay thing to think. Okay. Michelle, ciao from Italy. Ciao back. I know some parts of Italy really well. Others I don't at all. I know Tuscany quite well. Nobody knows Tuscany better than me. Unbelievable, beautiful community. What is happening to our world? Martillo's done gift memberships. Thank you very much. Dome is saying, I'm probably the only Iranian listening. I always appreciate your videos and insights. I mean, what an absolute tragedy to have such a massive gap between the population and the rotten regime, and for there to be no clear pathways to do anything about it. It's an extraordinary tragedy for an extraordinary culture. That's not necessarily the main story, but even now, one of the stories is that Iran is so rich culturally that effectively, from a cultural devastation point of view, I mean, you might say we've got bigger fish to fry, but from a cultural devastation point of view, it's like Israel and the United States are bombing Rome and Paris. My great friend Anita McNaught, the war correspondent, said once, I remember in one of her reports, saying that the destruction of Aleppo in Syria is culturally equivalent to the destruction of Rome and Paris. So what an unbelievably extraordinary country, and what a political disaster we've got, exacerbated by action from the outside to be even worse. Gaffer Bob, less than 10% likes. I just never ask for likes, but do likes now. Beautiful community. Do a few more likes to see if that spreads the live a bit more. What's your claim on what's your take on the idea that World War III has already begun. I answered that in the previous live. No, but at moments when world wars begin, the people in the particular instance when it begins often don't realize that that is what's happening until they retrospectively interpret it like that. Have I considered that Trump is the luckiest guy ever when I said that Trump could get lucky in Iran? When I said that Trump could get lucky in Iran, I effectively meant that something black swan like or left field would need to happen. I really, I'm skeptical that Trump can do anything except make things a lot worse with what he's doing. Greetings from Southern California, Vladdy boy. You know, when I lived in Israel, lived in Eretz Israel, I used to be called Vladdy. I lived there between 1990 and 1994. Can you expand on why Putin's monopoly on organized violence doesn't apply to Chechnya? Well, if you're literally asking how that works, let's say that you're somebody close to Mr. Kadyrov, you commit an apocalyptic crime in Moscow or Petersburg. Can the Russian authorities go and knock on your door and take you out of where you are in Chechnya the way they can if you were in another part of Russia? No. So it's a country within a country. And Putin is compromising by choosing a way of keeping the region stable, and then trading that off against the sort of diminution of sovereignty. And it's a country within a country to such an extent that, you know, in the West, people often ask, should Chechnya separate from Russia ideally? But if Chechnya faces that question, then another version of the question is, should it join Russia? Because in many ways, it is a separate country, even though it is entirely funded by Moscow. Are you personally scared about the world? No. I'm not at all scared about the world. I was just talking to a beautiful friend yesterday, and I said to her that my great grandmother, was from an aristocratic background in 1917 in Russia. I don't know the full story very well, but I used to have many conversations with her in the 80s because she lived long. And she was a teenager when the revolution happened. And she went from living in a sort of mansion, speaking French, having private tutors, to being moved with the family into one room of that house, urbanized peasants being moved into the other rooms, and working in a logging factory within a very short period of time. And they lost everything except a little box of jewels, which eventually was also stolen. So compared to that level of difference in how your life goes, the way you personally as American citizens are affected by Trump being in power versus Biden or Bernie Sanders is infinitesimal. And compared to that kind of transformation, the way you're affected by whether your democracy has collapsed or not is infinitesimal. If my democracy collapses tomorrow in the UK, I am not going, but only for health reasons, to see Mark Rothko at the Tate Modern. I'm not going only for health reasons to have wine at the Noble Rot on Lamb's Conduit Street. I am only not going to the Wigmore Hall to hear chamber music because I am not well enough. I am only not meeting friends over fantastic homemade pasta in a local restaurant because I'm not well enough. All of that is available. So even if your democracy collapses into smithereens, that difference is small relative to the sorts of tribulations, trials, blah blah, that humans have gone through in history. So I'm personally not at all scared about the world. And I am also, on top of what I've said, I'm a climate crisis alarmist. I think that the climate crisis poses a bigger threat to the sustenance of our democracies than Russia does, even though Russia poses a significant threat. So, very significant threat. So, but even allowing for that, the prognosis is really very bad for many countries. The prognosis for countries in the Middle East, climate-mediated prognosis, is really awful for the end of the 21st century. That's largely not the case in the West. So what I mostly feel is deep empathy for how much you are freaking out and how much most people I love are freaking out, like my closest friends are freaking out. But I'm not freaking out at all, like at all, not even 1%. But I'm not freaking out while fully recognizing the calamitousness of the stuff that's going on. I'm just saying that it's calamitousness and calamitousness and calamitousness and calamitousness and calamitousness, and not every kind of calamitousness is equivalent to every other kind of calamitousness. So that's what I would have to say about that. And that's important for us because it means in this micro, bubble, you guys can lean on me, because if anything, I am, being brutally realistic about what's happening. I'm not one of those people who is, shallowly optimistic about the patterns we're seeing. But I think because I'm not freaking out about it, it makes it easier for you to lean on me. My hot chocolate is basically finished, which is not good. Now, Lou is asking, is a number in the pants a Nietzscheanism? It's probably a Freudianism. But by the way, we should... Lizzie Anscombe, the wonderful and not wonderful and wonderful philosopher, student, the most famous student of Wittgenstein, once wrote a paper, scandalized some people, where she talked about taking a good shit as one of the examples she gave. So I'm actually somebody who thinks that there is a psychic benefit in normalizing analogies and metaphors and psychic explanations around different types of excretion. So I take a positive view on that from a Kleinian, post-Kleinian perspective. Hi, Vlad. There is an influence on social dynamics of things like war and natural disasters. I think Ukraine's national feeling is an example of this. Do you see an influence of this effect in politics? I'm not quite exactly sure I understand your question. The last main channel video that completely died in the algorithm, but was very good, and is highly recommended by a lot of people who have seen it, and including Anders Pack Nielsen. Watch it if you haven't seen it. It's called Putin's Winter Strategy Backfired or something. There I talk about 3 psychological techniques that Putin tried to play on Ukraine with his winter war, which partly succeeded but mostly backfired, even though they're awful. And I put them in a little bit of historical context, and I talk about Putin's trauma around the siege of Leningrad, where his older brother, died as a toddler in the early 1940s. So watch that if you haven't. For Ukrainians, it makes a huge difference whether you continue to think of the Russian assault as positive action, or you've kind of they're very dark hot chocolate, Ben F. Tremendously dark, darker than anybody's ever seen. Now, it's very important for Ukrainians whether they continue to relate this to the Kremlin assault as positive action by an enemy or a kind of a natural disaster, because it's just been happening and happening. It's not going anywhere. So we might as well just start working out between ourselves how we deal with this, and just accept it as just a rain or a hurricane. I think that makes a big psychological difference for political discourse. And of course, if you're asking this very, very, very broadly, yes, wars and natural disasters dramatically transform politics. I'm going to do a co-written piece soon on climate activism with somebody I disagree with about climate activism, because it's good to do co-written these days with somebody you disagree with, because it demonstrates the culture that people are still talking to each other. And I talk there about how climate disasters, when they occur in the West on a scale we haven't yet seen, are going to accelerate eco-fascist politics, pro-climate eco-fascist politics. TK McClone, good to see you. Post-Trump, is orange bronzer likely to be out of fashion? Similar to toothbrush mustaches. What's the fate of the MAGA brand historically? So it's possible that the MAGA brand is kept, but its substance is evacuated and replaced by something else. But I would recommend you to see that politically as still the death of MAGA and the substitution of it by a new authoritarian politics. So I'm more in the, we won't continue MAGA, we'll have another politics, whether it uses MAGA symbolic cover for itself or not, because MAGA is too tied to Trump and Trump's particularities. Trump's done a lot of damage to the orange bronzer community across the globe, but I think that you can still get away with it in the United States, but not in Europe. I think that this is one difference, namely that in the United States, a section of the population finds Trump normal. There is no section of the European population that finds Trump normal. In other words, even the authoritarian right that wants to ally with him politically thinks that he is a complete clown and is ridiculous. So nobody takes him seriously in Europe, including his political allies on the authoritarian right. They take his political project seriously. They don't take the man seriously. In America, the man is taken seriously because America is such a mellifluously receptive to extravagance country and extravagant silliness. So I think TK McClone, the answer is the orange bronzer is going to survive in America with a bit of a hit. He's done some damage. But in Europe, we were anyway less favorable to orange bronzer. But now we're even less favorable because we're finding Trump completely ridiculous, even those of us who are Trump's allies politically. Are you personally scared about the world we've done? STF, is Putin failing his way to success? His bet is that the West will implode on itself, and in the past 4 years, it feels like he's more right every day. So we are imploding at a smaller tempo than Putin would like. So for Putin, he's feeling frustration about the resilience of our democracies because they're fake as far as he can tell, and they should collapse. And he's frustrated about this. But yes, he's failing. And what I would say is that we're failing too. And the reason we are arguably losing to Putin in Ukraine, you could say Ukraine has won because Ukraine looks like it'll preserve its sovereignty. I still think Ukrainian sovereignty is at risk over the next 5 to 10 years. But you could say that because the Russians have failed to gain political control over Ukraine in half a decade of full-scale war, it's a win for Ukraine. I think that there are different ways of conceiving of victory and defeat here. And there also are different ways of talking about what it means for us to win versus what it means for Ukraine to win. Ukraine could sort of semi-win, whereas we could lose as the West. So here is what I'd say. Ukraine and Russia both losing. The question is who's losing more quickly and more slowly. We're also losing to the Kremlin, insofar as the Kremlin's aims are political control over Ukraine and the collapse of our democracies. But to directly address your question, what's absolutely remarkable is how utterly and bewilderingly incompetent Putin is. Putin is is very, very talented in several dimensions, but across vast other dimensions, he is an unbelievable loser. He cannot stop losing. He loses so hard every single day, and he's still beating us because we're losers as well. So, the profound incompetence of the United States and the European powers in dealing with Putin is extraordinary, because Putin is profoundly incompetent and yet is beating us. He's profoundly delusional. He's paranoid. He's passive. He should have taken far more advantage than he has of Trump's extensions of friendship. He could have done more to undermine the West that way. He's paranoid, insecure, passive, delusional, as well as being ethically repulsive, and yet he's beating us because he has a little bit more stable long-term vision. He's a post-truth communicator. His regime is a post-truth communicator, but he himself isn't. He has strategic aims that he slowly pursues. So it's basically somebody who is sort of driving a really shitty car with stuff falling out of it, but he's a good map. He's got a few techniques to keep repairing, things when they break. He just keeps going at 11 miles an hour. And, we're sitting in a much more powerful car, but we're literally moving backwards with, falling into a ditch off the road, running out of fuel, losing our map. So, and even if you allow for the fact that Trump is an ally of Putin in some respects, the incompetence of the way the Trump administration, even on their own terms, has dealt with Putin is breathtaking. And European incompetence is different. European incompetence is not because Merz and Macron and Starmer are stupid. It's because they are stuck in toxic and immobilized political systems. But basically, Putin is failing hard every day and still failing slightly less badly than we are. So that's what we're witnessing. So it's important to not sort of elevate Putin into some kind of James Bond-like villain. It's important to look at how pathetic he is, because it'll illustrate to us the depth and extent of our own incapacities, and that we might need to work on them, although our capacity to work on them is itself limited. Chester, what was the appeal of Putin in 2000? Putin was quite a mechanical project. Yeltsin completely misread Putin and later regretted, of course, that he put him in place. It could have easily gone otherwise. Historical contingency put Putin there, didn't have to. And Putin came with his own instincts. He was always anti-democratic. But much of early Putinism is a kind of act. Both its moderate pro-democratic elements are an act, because Putin was sort of on a kind of kinetic energy continuing what Yeltsin was about without meaning it. But also some of Putin's radical statements are not typical for him. Like, we'll nail all of the Chechens in the toilet is not Putin. It's like stuff he had to learn to say. So he sort of had to find himself. He never believed in democracy, but he sort of had to find himself over time. And we began to see a more authentic presentation in his second term. There is a video on the main channel called How Putin Became What He Is, or How He Became a Killer. Watch that. It's 2 or 3 years old, but it talks through the different terms of Putin in power and how they can be categorized. A lot of that old stuff is still very evergreen. Putin was an antithesis of Yeltsinite incapacity. So he modeled virility as a means to stability and as a means to a kind of partial remedy to national humiliation, as some kind of reliable actor could keep the country together, keep the country going. So that's the sort of ballpark of the image that was presented. It was the early Putinism was an image-making project, and there was a team putting this image together. And Putin was in part just acting. And so that contrast worked very powerfully against the ill and incapacitated Yeltsin. Great topic. I think I could say a lot less sort of general and banal things that I've just said, but we'd need a longer conversation. How do the attacks on the oil industry affect this war? Well, how does it change the politics of the region? We're looking at a very, very complex carousel of beneficiaries and victims. What I would say is that Trump's actions are roughly disempowering America and empowering America's opponents, or the opponents of the West. It's a bit of a naive thing to say, because in many ways Trump is himself allied with who would call opponents of the West. But all of this is working out favorably towards the Russians and the Chinese on balance. It's one thing I'd say. About the attack on the oil industry in Iran, well, that just mobilizes people around the regime and against the American Israeli attack. We've literally got oil rain happening in Tehran now. Is it incidental that what we have to look forward to in the collapsed democracy is more consumerism? No, it's because of consumerism that you will have citizens barely noticing that their democracies collapse. A lot of the negative trends, including wokeism and hyper-identity politics, were covers for destructive consumerism. BLM was partly a cover for destructive consumerism. BLM liberated people's capacity to reckon with racism privately, but its public impact was to bring it about that Trump was more likely to be elected, and that a trivial reckoning with racial exclusion substituted the deeper, more class-based reckoning with racial exclusion in the United States, because racial exclusion remains, and racial deprioritization especially, it remains very deep in the United States. So it's not that the cause of BLM was wrong, the cause of BLM was correct. The politics was bad, because it was hyper-identity politics and it was counterproductive. So a lot of the woke stuff is consumerism. And that kind of consumerism leads to authoritarians, anti-democratic authoritarians coming to power. That's the problem. That's the problem. That's why we have to reckon very strongly with the rights of trans people. Now we have to start very aggressively defending the rights of trans people now, because the discourse that has been used to defend their rights has proven counterproductive, and we need to adjust it. Otherwise, we're going to have very scary reversal of already woefully insufficiently advanced trans rights. I know there are many conflicts between trans rights and biological women's rights, and they need to be politically brokered. There's no way one side can just gain automatic priority. And that itself is a point that has been unavailable to trans discourse recently, which is a real problem. So we need to confiscate consumerism and cheap neoliberalism out of the way we argue for the rights of excluded minorities. And so what I'm going to do with my channel is I'm going to raise my voice more strongly in defense of minority groups, including trans people, over the next few years. Because we're looking at a very scary collapse there, very scary collapse of rights protection. We need to do our best to stop it, and the current discourse we have to generate that rights protection is too woke and too consumerist to be effective. And even in the Russian context, the way neoliberalism morphed into hyper-neoliberalism, the way consumerism morphed into might is right politics, is a big factor in the cause of the Ukraine war. So part of the reason the brutal tyrant in the Kremlin invaded Ukraine is consumerism. Yeah, it's partially caused by the anarchic neoliberal insanity that Russia toyed around with in the 90s. Then there are deeper continuities with the sort of various other imperial patterns that hold for the Soviet formation and the Tsarist formation, but still. Don't underestimate how consumerist authoritarian populism is, and don't underestimate how we have been overly consumerist and how we've tried to argue for some of the most important causes. Notice how badly class has been absent from our arguments about the rights of various minorities. So a lot of our arguments for minorities have essentially been a cover for a situation whereby superficial progressivism takes the place of a deeper progressivism. Notice how friendly big corporations turned out to be to wokeism. Why? Right? Some very good functional analysis there of a Marxian kind would be useful, even if, like me, you're not a Marxist. So there we go. But I can't say enough how worried I am about minority rights at the moment, not just because these mofos are coming for them, and by the way, because when they're coming for the rights of minorities, they're claiming that the problem is wokeism. It is now 98% of critique of wokeism is not critique of wokeism. It's actually critique of inclusiveness. It's critique of democracy. So the legitimate anti-hyper-identity politics, anti-wokeist critique remains. It's there, but don't confuse it with the BS that people like J.D. Vance are going to come up with in the years to come. That's just an authoritarian counter-revolutionary wave against the ephemeral phase of hyper-identity politics. It's not just a critique of it. So most things that are positioning themselves as critique of hyper-identity politics are in fact attacks on inclusion, attacks on democracy. And so that's another way we have to keep two things in mind. Almost all critique of wokeism and hyper-identity politics online is authoritarian BS. But that doesn't mean there isn't a valid critique there too, and that we haven't fallen into a sort of unproductive political dynamic when we practice that kind of politics as a model for advancing social justice projects. We need a new vehicle, new model for that advancement. And the other thing we're missing, and this is really scary, is that a lot of us are just wandering around in this haze where we think that the advances we've made with the rights can't roll back, which is just mad. Of course, we can have a rollback of the rights of uh, Black Americans. Of course, we can have a rollback of women's rights, biological women's rights. Of course, we can have a rollback of trans rights. Of course, we can have a rollback of the rights of neurodiverse people, the rights of autistic people. Look at the kind of trash the Trump administration has been saying about autistic people. So there's going to be all kinds of fascistized exclusion, and we need to get a lot better at tackling it, because the kind of discourse that we wrongly thought worked a few years ago is definitely not going to work in the future. We need something else. All right, rant over. Dane of the Hill is saying, Alastair and Rory, on the rest is politics. I'm not worried about the rest is politics, having quarrels on the show. But I feel they're spinning their wheels a bit on Trump and wringing their hands, international rules-based order failing and not able to look ahead. So I think that's a valid, I mean, clearly you love them, and I think and I do too, and I think it's a valid question. I think that Alastair is stronger on the sort of core dynamics of everyday politics, like what's the next thing that Gavin Newsom or Emmanuel Macron should do. Alastair is extremely brilliant on that. Rory probably sees bigger picture better than Alastair, but Alastair is very open and he learns quite fast. He's very receptive. He's extremely curious. Alastair, did you know that what you thought was normal is in fact, really weird? And he'll say, oh, yeah. I am more radical than Rory, who is a bit more radical than Alastair in terms of what I think we should do in response to the crisis we face. I think I would find Rory's solutions insufficiently radical and too much aspiring to regalvanize a centrism that has become culturally unavailable, politically unavailable to us. Exactly where the disagreement lies, I can't pinpoint, because both of us are sophisticated. When two sophisticated people have a slightly different view, you can't point the exact point where the disagreement occurs. So yes, I'm a bit more radical than Rory, who I think is a bit more radical than Alastair. But they're moving, so I don't make that much of it, to be honest. And I wouldn't underestimate how open they are to deeper critiques of, our situation, what we need to do about it, right? I mean, I did a pretty strong takedown of some of the messaging in the Labour political, party ad a few weeks ago. I know Alastair saw that, and he would not be unempathetic to things I said there. So, everybody's moving and reacting at a different tempo to a fast-changing world. I do think it's fascinating, not in a sort of boom, boom, we'll zing him way, to reflect on Rory's prediction that Kamala Harris was going to win, because I think that Rory still needs a year or two of maybe deeper evolution that takes care of the sorts of things that have to be systematically wrong to have caused them to think that. Because obviously a lot of you also thought that, but you were really wrong. And so what's going on there? It's not just an excess of optimism. Something structural is being misunderstood. In other words, the depth of the control that social forces that are undermining our democracy have over outcomes we're seeing was underappreciated in Rory's analysis, many of yours analysis. A lot of you clung on to my messaging about how bad the Trump campaign was. The Trump campaign against Kamala Harris was so bad, it could have been better run by an 11-year-old. But Trump won. Back to what we're saying about us and Putin. Putin is an incompetent calamity. He is a walking failure. But we are struggling so much, he's slightly ahead of us on some dimensions. Same with Trump. Trump was a disaster. He was effortlessly beatable. Trump should have been nowhere near power in 2024. If a highly incompetent campaign was run against Trump, Trump would have been obliterated. But we didn't have a highly incompetent campaign. We had an impermissible calamity that still could have just about beaten him, perhaps. So that's the issue. And a lot of you clung to that talk about how calamitous the Trump campaign was when I kept saying that Trump is very likely to win. And it's again about keeping two things in mind. So I think that there needs to be that deeper reassessment for Rory, just to make sure Rory doesn't think that what went wrong is that he just got too optimistic. Because if that's the analysis, it's not good enough. But I don't think Rory thinks he just got too optimistic. I think Rory understands that he was abstracting away, almost at a kind of physiological level, some social forces that he knows are actively present at an intellectual level. So that was a failure of, I shouldn't say that in public because it's not the right word. It's a failure of integration, we would say. I use the word integrity for integration. Integrity for me means things being together, not being good or bad, but things being together. So if one part of me isn't together with another part of me, I lack integrity. It's not a great way to speak in public because lack of integrity normally means being unethical, but that's not what I mean by it. It's lack of integration, lack of togetherness. So if Rory put together his intellectual analysis with every other part of him, he wouldn't have been able to say that. And that period of historical transformation for us is commensurate, is coexistent with this period of different parts of us catching up with the world around us at different tempos. So maybe some of Rory's physiology wasn't as caught up as his intellect was with the social forces that are conditioning the state of our democracies. So that's what I'd say about that. Terrific question. A few people have requested an episode from me just on that mistake that Rory made, because everyone knows that I love Rory, and therefore it'd be constructive. I wouldn't just zing. I might do that because I actually think it's a wonderful sort of intensification of something that affects all of us as we react to this fast-changing world. It almost feels like most people are a year or two behind in the way they react to what's going on. Alex, you are the most consistent question asker. Many flatten Iranians into liberals awaiting intervention or theocrats prone to terrorism. How do I frame a football to assert that Iran is plural and more averse to intervention than we credit? So there are Iran country experts. I'm not one of them. There are some brilliant ones, so follow them. But this is a bit of a generic question, so we can take it generically. There is the biggest force that could unify Iran under the best possible conditions is a kind of civically tending nationalism. It's not clear that that nationalism put together with the awful regime and the resentment of it for its hypocrisy, for its bloodthirstiness, for its control freakery, for its economic calamitousness, that resentment does not translate into a commitment to counter majoritarian institutions. It slightly more easily might translate into the aspiration to model yourself on some fairly authoritarian but relatively stable and prosperous countries in the Middle East. So that's one thought. A second thought is you don't have a bunch of clowns, billionaires, a dude with a personality disorder, an orange bronzer, Mar-a-Lago influencers, Fox TV presenters who have no idea what they're doing, drop bombs on you, bomb you 1,000 times a day together with Israel, and then, you know, gather together and form a democracy. That sort of action does not increase the odds of democratic formation. It undermines them because, in part, just violence and political ghastliness begets violence and political ghastliness. There are also people in Iran, a majority, who despise the regime but do not want the country to collapse. And they're seeing that these malign mofos, the Israeli government, do have an eye out for the collapse of Iran as a state. Trump would love that. Netanyahu would take it. It's not his priority. He would love a democratic Iran. But the Israeli government, as a plan B or as a plan C, would kind of take a collapsed state. You don't want to be in a collapsed state. So, you know, and you've got to understand how possible it is to be outraged about the bombardment and be outraged about your regime, be outraged about the recklessness and aimlessness of the bombardment. From the US perspective, at least, Israel has more of a strategy. So, weirdly enough, one important voice in the discourse has been elevating the notion that, you know, for a lot of people, something like a Putinite scenario prior to the Ukraine war might be a destination. So, what's a thread driving through all the sort of things I've lamely articulated? It's that you've got to try to get into the heads of people on the ground and not just make 2 or 3 analytical moves and think that you've worked out what they want. Do I ever explain why we're slipping towards a loss of democracy? Yes, I think there are 3 or 4 social forces that are driving this. You might say, Vlad, that's not enough of an explanation. Then my answer is, well, I've got to talk about it more then. Slimkis says, Vlad, you were early for your own live. It's at 8:30. I'm fuzzy and confused. A question: hyper-neoliberalism and the subsequent inequality is not compatible with liberal democracy. Do we need wealth redistribution in order to restore political democracy? Well, wealth redistribution is A, not easy to do. B, is a necessary but not a sufficient condition of the restoration of faith in democracy. But generally, I'm not going to say this is the only issue we face. This is one of 4 or 5 issues we face. But I would say that when you have such massive gulfs in wealth that they look ludicrously illegitimate to people at the bottom, and B, they generate such segregation of life that people in one end of society don't meet people in another end of society at all. It's almost like living in separate countries. That creates a problem, namely that you can't think of your country as one country if your division of economic power is such that you effectively have countries within countries. So that's a big problem, yes. You don't need to be a Marxist. You can even be a right-wing conservative, pro-institutional conservative, who we love and welcome on this channel, and say, well, yeah, guys, at this rate, the problem here isn't there is some kind of left-wing objection to it, a social justice objection to it. There's a democracy objection to it. If people are to such an extent in such radically different worlds, how the hell do you expect them to feel they're sharing a society together? And if people don't feel that, they're going to vote for calamitous candidates. What is even the UK identity today? Konstantin Lozov is asking. Oh, it's quite a lot you can say. That's quite a lot you can say about UK identity. And you can lean on our history of parliamentary democracy. You can lean on our history of the empirical tradition and philosophy that is not just in philosophy, but it is a product of culture, and it feeds back into culture. So something very remarkable about the empirical tradition of thought on this island that makes this island in many ways open to individuality, open to giving idiosyncrasy a chance. That's important. You could make a list, yeah, and still talk about a whole bunch of positive stuff. We don't do that enough. We leave too much positive talk about what the UK is to Nigel Farage. Where is all the left-wing patriotism? Where is all the centrist patriotism? Okay, I've got to speed up because I'm not answering questions in a timely manner. Gaffer Bob says work was too much embraced as good marketing and abandoned just as easily in the service of the bottom line. Yeah, this is one of the tragedies of corporations going woke, is that these same corporations who shouldn't have gone woke are going to go authoritarian, and they're going to suck up to Trumps and Orbans. But as I say, it's about keeping two things in mind. People are really struggling. Small minority of people in the community are really struggling with the thought that there's massive exclusion, but certain kinds of hyperidentity ways of fixing it are not best practice. Okay, let's do a few super chats, see where we're up with that. I'll be more brief. How scared are you of nuclear war here? Canadian question. Per century, there's a really unacceptably high but still low as a percentage point risk of nuclear war. That's what we've got. That's what we've got. The good thing I would say is that most of the time, you're not going to get a situation where nuclear risk jumps from moderate to extra high overnight. You're going to be able to see this happening. We're not seeing that happen right now, right? So that's one good thing. You're unlikely to wake up to a strategic nuclear exchange on a Tuesday having not noticed anything wrong on a Monday. So that's one semi-reassuring thought. And then I would say that the last time we faced sort of a moderate nuclear crisis was in the early months of Putin's failures in Ukraine, the full-scale invasion, autumn 2022. There'll be more crises, but even that 2022 crisis wasn't a great crisis. It wasn't as bad as the one or two sort of greatest peak moments. It could have got bad if the Russians kept on losing really badly. That's a paradox we've had with the Russians. If they do really well, nuclear risk increases. If they do really badly, nuclear risk increases. Mario, Iranian dissidents tell me to anticipate a Persian supremacist regime to take over with mild US-Israel alliance. Odds for liberal democracy are very low in Iran. Odds for liberal democracy are very low in Iran. Odds for a regime that is less ideologically radical are reasonable, which would be to sort of break this enterprise that Iran has been on the wrong end of, that you've got to be an absolutely principled follower of the revolution, otherwise your entire political project will collapse. That's not entirely wrong from a sort of evil strategic point of view, because the Iranians saw the collapse of the Soviet Union when it tried to reform, and that is a lesson. But as I say, we've got to distinguish a demand for something that is not what we've got there now from a demand for, Danish liberal democracy. Lou is talking about the Hormuz choke, and my thoughts on it. I've got thoughts on it. I'd love to leave that to economists. I think that would be more ethical. I'd love to leave it to economists about what kinds of economic crises could follow, who is impacted, who is implicated. I think it'd be a little bit unethical for me. I'm following the story. I'm reading a little bit of economic analysis. It'd be unethical for me to talk about it. Zack Potat, just thank you. Daniel, will Iran in the long run survive as a religious state? Yeah, unless there is a state collapse, but there is certainly high demand for something less extremist and less ideological across the country. Zonk, I agree, execution is terrible, but what's your alternative? A regime that's pursued nukes for decades, hiding 400 kg weapons grade uranium. Were we supposed to watch another North Korea develop? So Iran's nuclear program was under control. In other words, there's no connection between the position Iran must never be a nuclear power capable of launching nukes all over the world and this war. There's no connection. If that's your overwhelming singular aim, you don't need to do this war. You had plenty of avenues to control Iran's nuclear program without this war. So my question to you is, why are you asking such a ridiculous question? Like, what has gone wrong with your thinking that you're asking such a ridiculous question? Moreover, nuclear risk is increased cumulatively by Trump's war because it tells two things to small countries. A, get nukes, otherwise you're never going to be safe. And B, don't hedge like Iran did. Don't be on the verge of having nuclear weapons capacity, because that's going to endanger you more, not less. So nuclear risk has gone up globally. The risk of nuclear war has gone up globally as a result of what Trump did. Trump had every possibility to ensure that the Iranian nuclear program could never culminate without doing the war he did. And under what circumstances can you think that Iran was close to having that capacity without the United States being able to stop it by negotiation or by limited use of force. It's not clear to me what you're thinking here. It's a generic Twitter question you're asking. It's not good enough intellectually, I'm afraid. Miss you nothing. However constructive Campbell might be, Alastair Campbell, I have friends who'll never listen to him on Iraq because of his Iraq history. Yeah, and there'll be a lot of people in that camp. If you want my view on it, we can't afford that. We need every constructive voice on deck contributing to our discourse. So absolutely not of that view. I think if Alastair is being a constructive voice, we need him hands on deck. But other people might feel differently. So why did Zack Polanski, the leader of the UK Green Party, seem to disturb Rory so much? Because Zack genuinely didn't have a clue about how an economy works. And Rory found that deeply offensive. You're trying to tell Brits how they should live, but you haven't developed your own positions on basic issues or understood basic economic mechanisms. That was Rory's upset. I wouldn't be upset like Rory was with Zack. There's a little bit of a kind of normalized expectation in Rory's anger at Rory's frustration with Zack. For me, I'm more pluralistic about what I accept. I accept Zack's economic incompetence, if you like. And then I just want Zack to make proposals that stretch our public discourse. They put on the table questions as questions we can again reopen, having been told by centrist technocracy that they're closed. That's what Zack needs to be doing constructively, because that's what Reform are doing very effectively. But we also need to get centrists doing that too, reopening questions that seem to be closed. We thought only X and Y were okay positions on immigration. Well, we need to broaden that because we're out of touch with public sentiment here. You think only X and Y are okay positions on economic policy? We have to broaden that because people feel differently now. The consensus we're supposed to converge on is now out of touch with how the country feels. And therefore, there's a legitimacy crisis. So we have to rescue the delimited centrist conception of what is okay to talk about out of this kind of narrowness that it's stuck in, but do so responsibly. And Zack's job, you might say he's doing this badly, he's doing it well, but his job is to do that in a more inclusive and responsible way than the way Farage is doing it. When the people who are, if you like, economically competent are failing so badly, people who are more open and who understand a little bit better the bigger political dynamics at hand are going to come in and make proposals, and they might be less economically competent. That's just the world we live in. So I kind of take it more as, what basically we can realistically expect from actors in our political scene, from the, if you like, deprofessionalization of the political scene, in the sense that we're going to have to accept that some of the people who are going to bring more openness to our political environment, they're going to be a bit less, expert and competent on some key subjects. I think that's a bit inevitable. Rory's position is understandable, but I think that I probably feel more like Rory does if I was Zack's friend. I'd say, Zack, you've got to speed up on the economics of it, catch up. But I'm not Zack's friend, and so I take Zack as he comes a bit more than I think Rory does. That doesn't mean I support Zack, it just means I take him as he comes. Marios is saying how bad Netanyahu is. Hage Barisic is saying, hello. You once again said Stoicism is not a really good way of dealing with realities we face, but you never elaborated. I promise I'm going to do a Stoicism chat, if not on the main channel, definitely on the philosophy channel. what approach to philosophy would you recommend? I don't recommend an approach. I recommend being open, and I recommend asking questions, and I recommend being in contact with quality texts and quality analysis. The problem with a very central thread in Stoicism is that it is relativist about goods that are a central part of a fulfilling life. Stoicism says if you can't have B, don't expect B. But it might be that B is or isn't a constitutive part of a healthy human life. And if that's the case, then Stoicism is just cheap evasion. So Stoicism is missing an account of the centrality or non-centrality of the human goods it is recommending that you give up on if you can't easily have them. Which makes it guilty of a shocking elementary philosophical failure, and it makes it quite useless as a practical guide to life. A lot of Stoicism is quite useful. So I don't feel I've covered it by this, but what I'm saying is that there are a couple of central problems with it. This is one of them. You're not a serious person unless you give an account of the place of the goods and values out there in a meaningful and rich human life. You can't make that account be secondary to a contingent question of how far these goods are accessible to you or not. The things that I'm missing from my life because I am ill are things about which I ask a question. Would a good life for me consist of these things being in my life? And the answer is yes. So the Stoicist position on why I haven't written 2 academic philosophy books by the age of 44 yet, because I'm ill, would be, well, I've got to make sense of my life without them, and that my life ultimately could proceed in a flourishing way without me missing that. But that's just an evasion of the question of whether these 2 books that I needed to write are or are not a central good I should have in my life. So basically, it's trying to cop out of a question that any philosophical account of a flourishing human life needs to put right at the center of it. Is there any message to the Iranian diaspora and many Iranians in Iran too, who cheer the war and want regime change? Don't overestimate how many people cheer the war. Also, there's a little bit of an Iranian diaspora industry, because obviously, if you align your position with U.S. imperialism, you get an audience. But don't think that just because you're hearing 11 loud accounts on Twitter that represents everybody. So basically, my answer is just pluralize the Iranian diaspora, treat them as individuals, respect what they have to say, evaluate what they have to say, understand that some of them will be incredibly insightful, that others will be a bit naive. Pluralize is the answer so often. Okay, let's dig around for some questions. We're going to go to 2 hours. We're going to go 22 minutes more, beautiful community. Somebody's saying that people are paying for Vlad in the UK. No, I am paying because I pay tax in the UK, and I basically, because of the complexity of my illness, I basically don't use the National Health Service. So I'm paying. Also, like, I'm more British than like a lot of the people who complain at me. I've been here for 30 years and have a deep relationship with what this country is. The trouble is I don't need to defend myself. This is the tragedy of what we're talking about in terms of the politics of exclusion. I'm very fearful of the fact that I'm a white heterosexual male, and that unfortunately I'm in the undefeatable party. And I think there's going to be a lot of very destructive white identitarian politics in the 2030s. So I don't like how there's going to be a lot of toxic politics made on behalf of the group that I belong to. Vlad, what's the standard for whether or not the question is worth taking in a Q&A like this? I most of the time I'm literally just randomly picking questions and just answering whatever's in front of me. Today I won't be able to answer every question because we've got a nice healthy group. I get less correspondence now, but I get a lot of correspondence now. So my aim is to reach 10% of it and answer. What I tend to do is, rather than just go or go yes with one letter, one word response, I tend to pick maybe 1% or 5% of communication and actually give a nice answer. I think that's better than answering 5 people with just a one word answer. And I'm always trying to answer as much as possible. The best way to contact me and interact with me is via a Q&A like this. Otherwise, what I would recommend, obviously, if you're in a position to do that and you really need some guidance, get a consult with me. But otherwise, bombard me every 3 months with a repeated email to get in touch with Vlad. And eventually, there's a good chance I'll answer. But even now that we don't have this 250,000 return audience on the main channel, we're a lot less because I've been sick and away. The amount of correspondence I get would not be sufficient. Even I would not, even if I had a team of people, would not be sufficient to get back to everyone. So I would love to, but it's just not possible. So this is by far the best rate of return success here. If you ask a question in this context, I think also Twitter. I think sometimes if I'm in the mood, I just answer on Twitter. That's probably where I answer the most. Together with here. Okay. Is there anyone in the Trump administration clever enough, great question, to destabilize the Middle East in order to increase refugee pressure on Europe as a way to aid the far political right? So Tim Snyder did a piece today saying, I wonder if Trump is trying to have terrorist backlash intentionally in the United States from what he's doing to take political control over the country. And I love Tim. I just think some of the way Tim grounds you through this journey of democratic decline is beautiful. Like, he has moments where he's just absolutely stunning. But Tim's wrong. There is absolutely no chance in hell that Trump is thinking that, because Trump is not strategic enough to think that. And then Tim says, but unless it's that, we don't have a reason to understand why he's doing the war. We have. I'm going to do a main channel video where I'll explain how Trump's pursuit of spectacle has caused him to enter this war, his pursuit of the theatrics of wartime presidency. So Tim is stunning. He's just beautiful, but he's wrong on both counts of that Substack, and he's not even close. He's wildly wrong. But there is a very big but. And maybe in that sense, Tim is right. What I've just said applies for the next 6 months or the next year. Is a Trump administration that's staying in power longer, toward the end of its term, or somehow it manages to get into a third term, could it do it then? Yeah. So Tim is wrong on both counts, but Tim is wrong holds for only 6 to 12 months. That's what you have to understand in a dynamic of transformation like the one we have. What Tim is saying could be true in a couple of years. It's absolutely not true now in my analysis. Again, somebody defending Tim would say, look, what Tim is doing is trying to link domestic politics and foreign policy. And what are you doing, Vlad, on your damn channels? Like you're tearing your hair out. You're doing it all the time. You are trying to link domestic politics and foreign policy. You're constantly saying we can't support Ukraine enough because our democracies are in decline. So Tim is linking that too. So Vlad, maybe you're unfair because even if Tim is wrong on both counts, he's doing a constructive public intellectual task. For me, no, because Tim is sane washing Trump when he does that. Tim is over rationalizing Trump. And that's not okay. It's just not constructive in this case. So we just love Tim Snyder here. And it's absolutely brilliant, actually, because I as much as I loved him, I also have criticized him on several counts, and I get the most unbelievable letters from people. Vlad, I cannot believe that you dare to criticize Tim. Unsubscribed, unsigned from Patreon, unsubscribed, and I am even going to call my friend Ricky, who lives in another town, to tell him to unsubscribe because you criticized Tim. I cannot believe you would do that, and I spent 3 years with you, and you did that. You said a bad word about Tim, which is nice because it shows how much people love Tim, and I basically think Tim does such great public intellectual work. A lot of academics really resent Tim because he often does say things that are overreach, like his claim that the Kremlin is being genocidal in the way it gathers soldiers from ethnic minority regions, which is not the case. It's driven by political reasons, not ethnic rebalancing reasons. But Tim does brilliant work. I've caught Tim in the last week or two just doing amazing grounding work with democratic citizens, and you just got to call it straight. Brilliant grounding work. Top notch. But these emails are amazing. I do hope none of you will do that with me, but I bet some of you will. I bet some people are getting messages like, "You criticized Vlad. I'm unsubscribing because how dare because Vlad you can't because he's got a beautiful community and so you can't criticize Vlad. He said a bad thing about Vlad. I'm unsubscribed everywhere. I give you 7 pence donation 8 years ago. I want it back because you criticized Vlad." That happens a lot, but it also just shows how much we're like little bubbles, and it's almost like we don't even think when somebody says, "Oh, Vlad's misjudged something." You think Vlad good, therefore he couldn't have misjudged it. Therefore, this is an attack on your identity as a member of Vlad's community. Let's not do that. And it's like, dude, relax. I loved him. relax. I loved him. Tim is brilliant. It shows your true colors. It's amazing. Okay. Now I have lost all perspective and maturity. Let's gather ourselves a little bit. I can't give practical advice on the nuclear program. It's just not my expertise. What are the comparative levels of relevance to these strikes of the Epstein files and Israel's imperative? I say this, Rowan, right, as I make carrot pancakes and send my love. Carrot pancakes sound amazing. I do not think that the Epstein files are a central reason for Trump's attack, but I think they are a factor. That's how I'd categorize it. The biggest factor is a combination of extreme strategic clarity and clarity or articulacy from Netanyahu to Trump, combined with Trump's unquenchable thirst for ever escalating theatrics. Thomas says, I agree with Vlad about nuclear war. This is absolutely horrific for nuclear risk in the 21st century. That you basically had the United States having in its power the dynamics of the Iranian nuclear program. The United States had power over it. And despite that, in the midst of negotiations, it attacked. It, it just is absolutely horrific message to non-nuclear, non-hegemon states about what they must do. I mean, this is not a complex point. I think we all understand it. Sometimes points as simple as this aren't true because they're just too simple, too good to be true, too elementary to be true. But this is true. This stuff is really, really bad as a motivator for potentially vulnerable states, authoritarian states to accelerate. Let's have a look. Why have ideology and substantive coherent policy evaporate from the political discourse? In part because you're less electable if you talk in a non-post-truth way about the world. Because in a crisis of trust, people are more easily pushed to buy into magical solutions that give them certainty in a world in which everything feels in flux. Given the deep unpopularity of this war within the MAGA right itself, I would be slow about that, adds 998. Do you see this leading to a decline in right-wing populism generally in the West? No. This war accelerates right-wing populism. Recklessness and destructiveness undermines particular post-truth authoritarian ex-right projects, but it doesn't undermine ex-right post-truth authoritarianism in general. Get that distinction, right? Trumpism is going to implode. It's going to collapse. Authoritarian ex-conservative post-truth politics is going to grow. Don't overestimate the unpopularity of this in MAGA. MAGA is in many ways a post-truth movement. So I don't think it's remotely as relevant as it would have been in 1998 to put up stats on the page and say 82% of MAGA think this, 82%. If I sit here and I start saying that, I'll be misrepresenting something that these polls in turn, if you like, without further clarification, misrepresent. So you've got to be careful about this. I'm going to scroll down, search for question marks. You know what, YouTube? Give me a question mark feature so I can just click and only see comments with question marks. Does Stephen Hawking's life inspire you? No, because I haven't followed it. I also am aware that some people were saying he was not so lovely in his private life. I don't have any views about that. I haven't assessed that. So I just remember reading his books a bit as a child. when I first learned English, and then I've had no contact. Somebody who inspires me is the teenage Beethoven, because Beethoven was still healthy as a teenager, but already had a kind of extraordinary sense of access, an extraordinary capacity to see heaven from hell, which he then had to use when his health collapsed later. So I don't spend that much time thinking about the biography of composers. I think about their compositions, but I am very grateful for, I think, this kind of remarkable quality that Beethoven, as a man, a very difficult and screwed up man, but Beethoven had as a man when he was a baby man. Yeah. What are your thoughts on Konstantin Kisin? I have lots of thoughts on Konstantin Kisin. I think I don't find Konstantin a natural political commentator. I find he is more of a natural cultural commentator. I don't find that he is instinctively successful at grasping the workings of politics. But I've never spoken to him. We've interacted. I think we may have DM'd each other a couple of times or something like that, a year or two back. He's been very solidly supportive of Ukraine. Is very, very rare to find somebody in his informational space who is supportive of Ukraine. It's good. A few of you have asked me to review his latest debate with Destiny. I haven't watched it and I have no opinion on it. Until I watch it, if I continue getting bombarded with requests to comment, I might watch it. Obviously, Constantine in reach and numbers is doing tremendously well. I mean, he is everywhere in the UK. But let's be very clear: he doesn't know if the Iran war is a good idea or not at this point. Contrast that with the position I recommend. He would have voted for Trump, and he will be voting for Nigel Farage at the next election. How do I label Nigel? Political entrepreneur and post-truth authoritarian menace, right? So think of that gulf. Trivial question, not trivial, but trivial in this context. Who is your favorite composer? It's very difficult because it's a bit like asking, with the major composers, a bit like asking, are you in favor of the universe? Because you can't imagine, you can't imagine choosing between Bach, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert because they are essential to the formation of Western musical language. So sort of choosing against them just makes no sense. Then there are other composers who are very, very great, but they're more optional. And the Instagram is full of these questions: Mozart or Beethoven, Haydn or Bach, and it's like, oh, yeah. I mean, look, I can tell you, I mean, I am the greatest admirer of Chopin and Schumann, but I would choose Schubert and Beethoven over them if somebody came and tried to confiscate either the one or the other from me. I suppose my most atypical views, so you're going to dislike me, and you have a Romanian surname, so maybe you're very fond of the Russian composers, European composers. I am a bigger admirer in terms of my assessment of quality of Russian literature, 19th century, than I am of Russian 19th century and 20th century music. So, for example, I think Rachmaninoff is the greatest pop genius who ever lived, arguably, but I don't think he's is objectively a great composer. And I also have criticisms of Shostakovich. You'll be devastated, absolutely devastated to hear, even though I've heard a lot of really, really good live readings of a lot of Shostakovich. and I also demote Tchaikovsky. Oh gosh, is Greg Yudin alive and well? As far as I know, yes. Greg and I exchanged a couple of emails a year or two back. I keep thinking of having Greg on the channel. Um, I haven't heard from Greg for a while. I'm assuming he is alive and well in the United States. And I think he's working on a few important projects. And one of the projects he is working on is how do we give an account of global security that different countries could converge on? How to begin framing what would be an aspirational next international order after the collapse of this one. I think that's one of the things Greg is working on. I think Greg is absolutely exceptional, and he has been an absolutely unique service to Russian speakers. He has given them resources to, perhaps in a very realistic way, in a very scarily realistic way, make sense of what's happening that they otherwise didn't have. And he's got a lovely combination of intellectual honesty and really good social imagination, which is rare. So wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And still a young man. I think Greg's a couple of years younger than me. Is Rachmaninoff a greater pop composer than the Beatles? That'd be how I'd be framing it. I mean, that would be the debate. I don't want to say yes. I do think Rachmaninoff is a great genius as a manipulator of sentiment. All right, let me come back to politics. We're on the 2-hour mark. Let's take a couple of more questions. Make sure we haven't left any super thanks. I've got into so much controversy. I've criticized wokeism again. I've attacked Stoicism. Could you do another? I got one message about my wine video from a great wine connoisseur on another platform, on a wine platform, about my wine video. So I might do another one, but it's just silly. I taste wine once a week without swallowing it. I'd love to be able to swallow wine more. Some people seem to be asking me to debate Destiny. I think there was some kind of a thread asking Destiny to invite me. I have not had any contact with Destiny. I don't know that much about his work except watching clips online. The only thing I did comment on was that I thought that he got a bit overrun, not intellectually, but just charismatically overrun by Jordan Peterson, and he debated with Jordan Peterson. And people asked me, would I debate Jordan Peterson the way Destiny did? And I said that whether I debate Jordan Peterson, and Jordan is very sick now, so we wish him well, completely respectively of what we think his contribution to public discourse is. He's better, but he's very, very scarily sick, like edge of life sick he's been recently, so we wish him well. But the problem with me debating Peterson would be if I'm sick, it just wouldn't work because I'm too slow and verbose when I'm sick. If I am somehow miraculously in a better moment and we do it online, then it would work better because Peterson is actually intellectually self-aware and he would recognize that I'm more intelligent than him, which would be like absolute outrage to his fans. But actually, Jordan would recognize that. And he does have a tendency to recognize that with some of the guests he's had who he rates, like Ian McGilchrist. So it would go well because Jordan would actually behave with me the way he didn't behave with Destiny. because you wouldn't. But then it would need to be in person for that to work. I think it could break down online. And I can't do in person. I can't even go to my living room in person and sit there in my wheelchair for a long time. So it's all a no, no, no. And it's obviously not a priority. I do hope to speak to some really constructive voices, though, this year, if health allows, on my platforms. But if I debated Jordan Peterson in person, and my health was not utterly disastrous and I could focus and speak well, Jordan would behave really well in that debate. He'd behave disproportionately well, as he didn't with Destiny. Okay, guys, let's not get too carried away giving scores out of 10 for other commentators, other people. Comment on Peterson again. Stop it, guys. Stop it. I'll take one just because it is important to ground us in keeping two things in mind at the same time. Is there a reason for Jordan Peterson being an outed alcoholic? I think he still drinks. No, he doesn't drink. He has been extraordinarily limited in what he's put into his body for years because of the extreme autoimmune illnesses that he has that run in the family. There's a clip online where Jordan Peterson is on the Rogan podcast and he says, look, I had this debate with Sam Harris and it was just a nightmare because I'd had a teaspoonful of vinegar and that sent me into a complete brain chemistry collapse for a month and I was in the worst doom land imaginable. And people laugh at that. Oh my God, Jordan Peterson's entire world fell apart because he had a sip of vinegar. And it's true. That is actually how his body is reacting. And if you entered his body, you would freak out and you'd start crying like babies. So I wouldn't make these kind of funny comments because I don't think Jordan is a constructive public voice in my view. But from his health point of view, he's shown great courage and he's been through absolute hell. He still is ill with things that he bounces back from, so his health is in a much better place than mine. And he's got much more of a capacity to work, hopefully if he recovers from this latest big setback. But don't confuse your legitimate views of how Peterson might be speaking and constructive rot on stuff with, this tendency, which is inappropriate, to make negative remarks about his health. All right, let's take a couple more and then we'll be done. If I spoke with Peterson, I'd speak about Nietzsche. Do you think Kamala Harris should run for president? Polls put her in a winning position. It would be a total disaster for Kamala Harris to run for president, and she would stand a very, very excessively large chance of losing in a way that a couple of other candidates wouldn't. It would be ethically irresponsible for Kamala Harris to run for president. And it would be just offensive and disgusting if she did it. Absolutely offensive and disgusting and unacceptable. So I would strongly recommend both for her personally to flourish in other dimensions and for American polity to not get in on this project. This is not the politics you need to defeat the authoritarian right. Saturn Cat, let's take that question as a North Korean nuclear question afterwards. I want to take that too. I have come to things from the perspective of an anthropologist. I've got an MA in anthropology. My view is that all cultures must be respected and preserved, so non-interference should be the rule. Agree? Almost agree, but not for the reason you cite. Generally, we should be very, very slow to go to war in other countries. It's almost never a good idea. And so we should start with that as a thought. Like the number of people who are saying, oh, yeah, man, attack another country, good or bad, let's debate. It's almost always bad. It's good sometimes, but it's almost always bad. So start with that. But that's for practical political reasons. The question you've actually asked is self-refuting, because one of the things that different cultures differ on is on questions of the relative validity of different cultures' claims to one or another kind of life. And they also differ clearly, as you can see, on how far it's okay to interfere in other countries. So respecting the positions of different cultures in no way leads to a conclusion of non-interference, because non-interference is itself something that different cultures diverge on, right? So you have refuted your own question there. But the general political implication of your principle there is roughly right. You've got to be very, 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 very slow, unless you are fighting for your own survival, to go to war, unless it's a defensive war. What I think I would say about cultures is that we have to have the understanding that, on the one hand, and it's about keeping two things in mind, we have to have the understanding that on the one hand, you can't say that all cultures are equal to all other cultures in all other respects. They're not. Almost all cultures are superior and inferior to other cultures in particular respects, right? Germany is superior to Tonga musically. France is superior to Ukraine gastronomically, right? It's not close. So different cultures are better and worse than one another in different respects. However, what you should say, that's one thought you've got to have. So it's not flat equality, it's better and worse, but non-cumulative better and worse in particular different and incompatible and incommensurable dimensions. Then over and above that, what you have to say is, if a culture sustains life for a very, 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 very long time, it usually means it's got something to offer. I'll give you an example of a culture that was very disproportionately disliked by outsiders visiting it, and that's Tongan culture. When I lived in Tonga, and I interacted with the sort of Australian, New Zealand presence there, which is sort of NGO presence, human rights driven presence, community development driven presence. It was shocking how far left wing pro human rights people were saying, I've lived in Vietnam, I've lived in Cambodia, I've worked in Kenya, I've always got on with the local culture. But I just struggle with the Tongan culture. I don't love it. And my answer to that is, there can actually be a lot of validity there, but also you have to appreciate there are going to be a lot of good things we can learn from Tongan culture, virtually in virtue of the fact that it sustained itself for a long time. We can learn quite a lot about family networks, about collective life, about how people support one another. And you're going to see different dimensions expressed there. One of the reasons, quite frankly, that NGO folks didn't love being in the local culture is the level of corruption. My close friend, there was a partner in the past life who ran an NGO in Tonga, once woke up with a whole pot of money gone that's come in, and the accountant of the NGO had suddenly painted his house and maybe other houses in the village. And on the one hand, to us, that's corruption. On the other hand, from his point of view, it is corruption, but it's also the cultural compulsion to immediately share when you get access to resources. There's a conflict there. There's better and worse there. But what we shouldn't be afraid of is better and worse judgments of culture. So, for instance, Ukrainian culture has huge issues, but its political culture is in a slightly, is in a lot better place than the Russian one. If you look at Ukrainian soldiers fighting on the front line, compare them to Russians, the Ukrainian soldiers will, on average, be a bit psychologically freer. They'll be more penetrable, more accessible to us than the Russian ones. Cultural difference, a bit of cultural superiority, I'm afraid. Sorry. In a particular dimension. Russians are superior to us in how much they are less disenchanted by the disenchantment of the modern world than we are. We are superior to Russians because Russian culture is cumulatively just really sick and in a really bad way on many, many dimensions, right? So we're going to be making a range of better and worse judgments in different respects. That's what my beloved Chuck Taylor, the greatest living philosopher, would say. But you also have to realize that you've got to be extremely deferential to every culture at the level of the fact that if it's gone on for a long time, if it's sustained human life for a long time, it's got things to teach us and we've got things to learn from it. And it's got things that we don't have, that we can't import necessarily, but maybe it's got some things in a very intense form that we can borrow in a more moderate form and put into our own cultures. So that's the beginning of that answer. H. Barisic, thank you. There was a question about North Korea. I can't see it, but it's could Trump do something like this with North Korea? And the answer is no, probably not. But I have to outsource that question to nuclear weapons experts. If Korea can genuinely pose a threat not just to South Korea but to other countries and maybe even to the proximate coast of the United States, if that is true, then the answer is probably no, because you can't take that risk. And that's what countries are going to be feeling following Trump's attack on Iran. If that's not the case, then it's because experts are going to teach us that North Korea doesn't have as much capacity as I'm assuming it might in my answer. So it's purely going to depend on essentially what kind of missile technology Korea has, what kind of platforms it has to launch whatever nuclear weapons it has. Right? So that's it. And that's why nuclear power like Israel is untouchable in some respects. If the US cut off all aid to Israel of any kind tomorrow and wanted to boss Israel around and wanted to take Israel over, if Israel has a capacity to strike the US mainland, which it might not do, but it might have capacity to strike the European mainland with a nuclear weapon, there's not much you can do, right? So you put yourself in that safe zone if you gain nuclear weapons, and that's one of the things that unfortunately we're encouraging countries who don't have nuclear weapons to do when we do policy like this. All right. I want to hear more on Vlad's psychoanalytic talk about narcissism and the development and deformation of the human personality. We'll be talking more about this, I am sure. Can you make a psychoanalysis video? Well, I am not a psychoanalysis expert. I'm a baby. I am introducing a little bit of psychoanalytic understanding into some of the analysis I make, but I'm not like Richard Wollheim, my great hero, late hero, a psychoanalytic expert. Last question. Is Disney partly to blame for the culture of negative thinking? So here I would outsource it to my beloved Werner Herzog. And by the way, it'd be good to have Werner on the channel, wouldn't it? Let's think about that. Let's outsource it to Werner because he is the man who talks about the need for adequate imagery. I would largely say that Disney is a byproduct of our junk food relationship with imagery rather than a cause of it. But I do think that that question that Werner Herzog puts front and center, what does it mean for a culture to have adequate access to imagery, to have adequate access to adequate imagery, is a very, very important question. And it's urgent because of the extreme degradation of imagery that we're suffering through our consumption of rapidly scrolled through social media clips. The counter case here is that you've got to be prepared to engage with images that are difficult, with images that aren't ones you can respond to with immediate comprehension. That capacity to want to be interested, to pay attention, even though you don't immediately understand, is incredibly important. And so my answer is always, in your own individual ways, try to relate to this. And you might not need to find adequate imagery, as in film, because you might have a wonderful relationship with nature, for instance, or a wonderful relationship with the visual arts. But find some kind of adequate relationship to imagery too, even in your, online screen activity. Just like I said before, don't make all of your connection with politics negative. Don't make all of your connection with the screen just stuff that undermines you as sort of an engaged, receptor of the complexity of images out there in the world. Give yourself something positive when it comes to what you give yourself on the screen. Don't just give yourself, either negative things or means to an end things on the screen. Yeah, I'm on this side because I'm getting the news here, but make sure that there's something there that's positive, right? I don't know what it is. Could be that you watch an Ingmar Bergman or a Tarkovsky film. It could be that you just I don't know. It could be that you watch a non-trashy culinary program, a non-trashy cooking program, right? So not all YouTube content is trash. There's a lot of good stuff, and also there is stuff that's a bit trashy, but it's self-conscious about its trashiness, and that can also be healthy, right? So there's lots of healthy stuff to consume. I mean, friend of the channel's Adam Ragusia does wonderful things in the sort of cultural gastronomic space. So please have something positive in your relationship with the screen. It could be that and it doesn't matter what it is. It could be that you meditate and you watch videos with sort of beautiful, peaceful imagery of oceans or whatever. It could be that you watch something food related. It could be that you watch some art film. I don't want your nervous system to think, oh great, we're doing trashy junk food again every time you're near a screen. There has to be still a sense of magic, a sense of exploration, a sense of expansion connected with your experience of the screen. So let's all try for that. Please, Vlad, stop preaching. Leave people alone. You've run out of hot chocolate and clearly you're grumpy now. Lots of love, beautiful community. We've done very well today. Talk to you soon and bye-bye.